My wife and I had been living in Asia for several years, and we came back and took a trip across the country. And a friend of ours lent us her copy of a WPA guidebook like this, WPA Guide to Florida. Hers was one to New Orleans, and it's a 1930s guidebook. It seems like a relic from another age and not going to be very useful to travelers now. But when we got to New Orleans, I was really surprised at how vital and how rich its presentation of social history of people's lives, where it wasn't a glossy presentation of the way that the Chamber of Commerce would present New Orleans. It was the way that people lived in that city across race and class and a lot of issues that I didn't think that American government projects would sponsor until much, much later.
Right.
So that interest drew me in. It made me interested in the people who would put that together, that guidebook and 48 others, so that I wrote an article for Smithsonian Magazine about some of the people on that, and became convinced that there was an interwoven history, connections of people to explore in a book. And so I proposed that to a publisher. At that point, publishers were not so much interested. They were leery of the topic, but I kept talking with people who made it fascinating. I had the great privilege of talking with the late Studs Terkel, who even at 96 was alive and vital and remembered that period particularly when he first considered himself a writer very clearly. This was on the Federal Writers Project, was when he got to write scripts and became friends with people in Chicago, people who became great writers later, like Nelson Algren and Richard Wright. And he said it was a down time, but it was also an exciting time. And that's what convinced me that it was worth pursuing. So I teamed up with a filmmaker that I'd worked with before, Andrea Kalin, in Washington, and we proposed to the National Endowment for the Humanities a documentary film. And then as that got underway, I came back to the idea of a book that would be a companion to that and really get into more of the stories than we could cover in a film. And that's how Soul of a People as the book came together. The book, it was really a great privilege. It was spread out over about 8 years. And so it, in some senses, while a lot of that time was writing proposals and getting funding and getting support to go to the next phase, both with the book and the documentary, it allowed time to sort of sift through these wonderful collection, personal letters, exchanges between some of the writers, many of them very young at the time, in their 20s. One of the characters who sticks with me is a young woman named Margaret Walker, who at age 20, she actually had to lie about her age to get the job. But then comes on and joins with just this wide range of people, and her impressions, she wrote about this later, as well as wonderful poetry and novels, and she was a great teacher herself later. She just captured some of the dynamism of that experience. Others were unexpected for me to find papers of Jim Thompson, who was a noir novelist of the 1950s and kind of a pulp writer who wrote a great noir novel called The Killer Inside Me, and he worked with Stanley Kubrick later. But he started off in the 30s, and to see how some of his darker visions of human nature came out of interviews that he did in Oklahoma, and some of his sense of Oklahoma and West Texas history and people was fascinating. I guess another one we were only able to, because we were working so far after the 1930s, many of the people who we would want to have talked to and interview were gone. But there were a few left, like Studs Terkel, and in Florida, Stetson Kennedy. He had been a young firebrand in the 1930s in Florida, and he was just very generous with his time, and we got him both to interview him on camera for the film, but also more extensively for the book. and he just impressed me with his willingness to question the status quo as a young man, something that I didn't do really until after my Davidson time. A few of the other characters who stick with me are ones who really did not become famous later, did not even necessarily think of themselves as writers later. One Oneida tribe member named Oscar Archiquette in Wisconsin really expresses in a lot of the difficulty of his life, of the elder life, but and not only in English, but that project in Wisconsin documented Oneida life in the Oneida language also. In fact, is one link, a precious link for the Oneida members today to a language that's getting lost, and that would have been lost more completely if it weren't for some of the writers like Oscar. So there are a range of, I'll be interested in reactions to the lesser known and even the non-writer characters who really engaged with the task of holding up a mirror to America. So I hope that that different chapters in the book will draw out different reactions, and different characters will maybe trigger different questions as we go into this conversation about Soul of a People. I really look forward to your thoughts and your questions, and let's get this started.